The oppressive heat of a Missouri summer clung to Willow Creek like a shroud, baking the dirt roads into cracked, dusty scars. Sheriff Wyatt Thorne wiped the sweat from his brow, his wool uniform feeling like an unbearable weight. It was late July, 1874, and the rhythm of life in the sleepy town had been shattered by a single, unnerving anomaly. A wagon had been found abandoned near the Willow Creek Bridge. It belonged to Silas Kemp, a young, itinerant peddler known for his friendly chatter and willingness to venture to the most remote farms. Silas had been scheduled to visit the Larkins homestead 2 days ago. He never returned. Wyatt stood over the wagon, his dark leather boots crunching on the dried grass. The horses had been unhitched, presumably by Silas himself, and left to graze in a nearby pasture, a sign of hurried, but not panicked, departure. The peddler's wares were still neatly packed, bottles of tonics, bolts of cheap fabric, and a box of children's sweets. "He wouldn't leave his goods, Sheriff," remarked Deputy Garth, a nervous young man whose eyes kept darting toward the dense, shadowed woods that led up to the Larkins' property. "Silas needed that money." "No, he wouldn't," Wyatt agreed, his gaze fixed on a detail Garth had missed. A small, dark stain pressed into the dry wood of the wagon bed. It wasn't the red of a rusty tool. It was the deep maroon color of old blood. "Garth, fetch my rifle and meet me at the trailhead. I'm going up to the Larkins' place." The walk was steep and silent. As they ascended, the familiar, comforting sounds of the town faded, replaced by the humming stillness of the deep woods. Wyatt felt the transition acutely. The air grew heavier, the trees denser, and the sunlight barely managed to pierce the thick canopy. When the Larkins farm finally came into view, it was less a home and more a monument to desolate endurance. The house was a large, 2-story structure of gray, weathered wood, its windows small and opaque, like blind eyes staring out at the world. A tall, rusted iron fence surrounded the immediate yard, unnaturally silent. There were no sounds of livestock, no barking dogs, just an eerie, profound quiet. As they approached the back porch, a stench hit Wyatt, sharp and metallic, cutting through the natural smells of pine and damp earth. It was a smell Wyatt had grown to know intimately during his years in the city, a smell he had hoped to leave behind forever. The distinct cloying odor of preservation chemicals mixed with something subtly organic and deeply unpleasant. Jedediah Larkins answered the door. He was a powerfully built man, his face a landscape of harsh lines and suspicion, dominated by a pair of pale, unsettlingly clear blue eyes. His clothes were plain and dark, meticulously neat. "Sheriff Thorne." Jedediah's voice was a low, dry rasp. "We keep to ourselves here. What business brings the law to my property?" Wyatt held his features neutral. "Mr. Larkins, I'm looking for a peddler named Silas Kemp. His wagon was found abandoned near the creek. The ledger shows he was due here 2 days ago. Did you see him?" Jedediah didn't flinch. "The peddler was here. Did his business, sold us some flour and a bottle of pain oil. He left, heading back the way he came, around dusk. Did anything seem unusual about his visit?" Jedediah's hand, large and calloused, tightened slightly on the doorframe. "Everything about strangers is unusual to us, Sheriff. We value our privacy." Just then a small, gaunt boy, Elias, peeked out from behind his father's leg. His eyes were wide and bruised with fear. He looked malnourished, dressed in clothes far too large for his frail frame. "Hello, son," Wyatt said softly, focusing on the boy. "Do you remember the nice man who sold you sweets?" Elias's eyes flickered to his father, then back to Wyatt, and he whispered, a sound barely audible above the rustling leaves. "Downstairs." Jedediah's pale eyes flashed with sudden, frightening intensity. He grabbed the back of Elias's neck, pulling him roughly behind him. "The boy is sickly, Sheriff, confused. He spends too much time in the root cellar doing chores, that is all." The denial was too quick, the action too forceful. Wyatt didn't push. He knew Jedediah wouldn't let him inside without a warrant, and he had nothing tangible yet. But the boy's whispered word, combined with the lingering medicinal stench in the air, solidified the pit of unease in Wyatt's stomach. "I understand, Mr. Larkins," Wyatt said, stepping back. "I'll be going. But I have a duty to find Silas Kemp. If he turns up, or if you remember anything at all, you send word immediately." As Wyatt and Garth retreated, the silence of the farm returned, heavy and menacing. Wyatt couldn't shake the image of Elias's frightened eyes or the smell that clung to the place. It wasn't just rot, it was something deliberately contained. "Sheriff," Garth whispered once they were safely back on the trail. "What was that smell?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. He stopped and looked back up at the house, a dark, lonely sentinel against the darkening sky. "Garth, I need you to ride to Springfield. I need records. Births and deaths, specifically the Larkin families. Every single son they've had, and the official cause of death." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, tarnished silver locket he always carried, a subconscious anchor to the past he couldn't escape. "That wasn't the smell of illness, Garth," Wyatt finally said, his voice low and firm. "That was the smell of something being kept." The word "downstairs" echoed in his mind, suggesting not a storage space, but a crypt. The mystery wasn't just about Silas Kemp's disappearance. It was about the unnatural silence and the untold story of the 6 sons the Larkins were rumored to have lost. The truth is buried deep, and the only way to uncover it is to keep watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of this unfolding mystery. Deputy Garth returned from Springfield late the next evening, his face ashen, the dust of the road clinging to his uniform like a pale film. Sheriff Wyatt Thorne was waiting in his small, cluttered office, the glow of the oil lamp casting long, restless shadows. Garth dropped a sheaf of official papers onto Wyatt's desk. The sound of the dry paper hitting the wood was startlingly loud in the quiet room. "It's worse than we thought, Sheriff," he breathed, sinking heavily into the nearest chair. Wyatt took the documents, his movements slow and deliberate. The death certificates and birth records from the Missouri State Archives were official, signed, and stamped, yet they told a horrifyingly simple and contradictory story. Jedediah and Martha Larkins had 8 sons. The papers confirmed the births of Ezekiel, Thomas, Isaac, Samuel, Caleb, Daniel, Ezra, and Elias. The gaps between the births were typical for the era, but the death registry was what froze Wyatt's blood. 7 death certificates, all for the older sons, were filed over a period of 7 years, starting 18 years ago. The causes were consistent, a succession of vague, untraceable illnesses: fever, consumption, wasting sickness. Each certificate was signed by the same itinerant doctor who had passed through Willow Creek years ago, a man long since rumored to have drunk himself to death in St. Louis. The paperwork was official, yet felt fabricated, too neat, too repetitive. 7 boys, Wyatt murmured, running a thumb over the name Ezekiel, the eldest, dead at age 6. 7 deaths, all within 7 years. And yet the youngest, Elias, is fragile but alive. "The town talks of 6, not 7, Sheriff," Garth pointed out, bewildered. "And the story is that they all died in one winter of fever." Rumor changes to suit the storyteller, Garth. But the official record is almost worse than the rumor. It's a deliberate pattern of loss, too regular, too convenient. Wyatt stood up and walked to the wall map of Willow Creek County, his attention drawn to the vast, isolated patch of land surrounding the Larkins farm. The location, the isolation, the stern father, the sickly children. It creates a perfect environment for control. Wyatt returned to the desk, his mind working with the clinical precision of his Pinkerton days. He was now operating under the grim hypothesis that the 7 older sons had not died of natural causes, or at least their bodies had not been handled in a conventional way. Silas Kemp's disappearance and the distinct chemical smell were the key. "The smell," Wyatt stated, leaning against the desk edge. "Garth, that wasn't the smell of a root cellar or spoiled food. It was the smell of a practiced hand at taxidermy, or more grimly, anatomical preservation. That chemical mix, the formaldehyde-like odor, it's used to stop decay. Garth recoiled, his face blanching further. Sheriff, you don't mean... I mean, the Larkins kept something downstairs, something they didn't want the earth to claim. And when Silas Kemp, a man who travels, a man who sees things, went inside, he saw it. And he had to be stopped. The plan formed quickly, based on logic and the established habits of the Larkins family. The Larkins rarely leave the farm, but Jedediah has to resupply the chemicals. He can't get that locally. He has to ride to Harmony Crossing, a full day's journey, and he does it on the first Tuesday of every month. That's tomorrow. You're going up there, alone. Garth's voice was sharp with fear. I need to be alone. Jedediah and Martha are vigilant. 1 deputy is a visit, 2 is a threat. I'll make my move when Jedediah is gone, and Martha is focused on her daily routine. Wyatt spent the rest of the night cleaning his revolver and sharpening his mental focus. The horror wasn't in ghosts. It was in the cold, meticulous madness of a parent who could not let go. The fact that the family kept the bodies of their lost sons, perhaps believing they were preserving their memory or their souls in a deeply warped religious conviction, was chilling. This was a tragedy that had metastasized into a crime. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with an indifferent orange, Wyatt mounted his horse. The silence of the town was a deceptive veneer of peace. He was heading back up the wooded trail, not as an investigator seeking information, but as a lawman preparing for a confrontation with a terrible truth hidden downstairs. His objective was to locate Silas Kemp, and, more disturbingly, to confirm what exactly the Larkins family had been preserving with such zealous, macabre dedication. The trail to the Larkins farm felt heavier this morning, the stillness now feeling like the held breath of a predator. As he neared the house, he dismounted and tethered his horse far from sight. He moved through the dense underbrush, using the cover of the morning fog and the natural noise of the crickets to conceal his approach. He positioned himself behind an old, decaying barn, watching. He saw Jedediah emerge, his face grim, and lead his horse from the paddock. Jedediah did not look back at the house. A strange, unnatural departure for a man obsessed with control. He simply rode out, disappearing down the main path. Wyatt waited until the sound of the hooves had completely faded. He watched the house for another 20 minutes. He saw Martha Larkins moving silently in the kitchen, a silhouette in the window, clearly absorbed in her morning tasks. The time was right. He moved quickly and silently toward the back of the house, heading directly for the small, exterior wooden hatch that served as the root cellar entrance, the same area where the horrific chemical smell had been strongest. The descent into the Larkins' chilling secret was about to begin. This was not a ghost hunt. This was an investigation into the deepest, darkest capacity for human denial and obsessive love, twisted into an act of terrifying preservation. The root cellar hatch was secured by a heavy wooden bar, easily lifted. Wyatt paused, taking a deep, steadying breath of the clean morning air before descending into the concentrated horror. He lit a single kerosene lantern, the flame struggling for purchase in the stale, dense atmosphere below. The air in the cellar was thick, cold, and heavy with the medicinal scent he recognized, a pungent mix of camphor, alcohol, and the sickly sweet odor of decay arrested in time. The beam of the lantern cut through the darkness, illuminating rough-hewn shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables, sacks of potatoes, and hanging dried herbs, the typical contents of a remote farm storage. But the typical ended quickly. Beyond the food storage area, the cellar extended into a deeper secondary room. Wyatt stepped carefully, his boot kicking something soft on the dirt floor. A small, crudely carved wooden toy. It was the kind of thing a child would play with, abandoned and forgotten. He entered the second chamber. The lantern light swung up, revealing the scene in sickening detail. It was a charnel house disguised as a nursery. Lining the damp earthen walls were 7 custom-built, glass-fronted wooden cabinets, tall and narrow. And inside them, standing upright, preserved, dressed in the formal Sunday-best clothes of the 1870s, were the 7 missing sons of Jedediah and Martha Larkins. Wyatt stopped dead, a seasoned lawman forced to confront an act of familial madness that surpassed any morgue or crime scene he had witnessed. His hands were steady on the lantern, but the blood drained from his face. The preservation method was crude yet effective. The boys' bodies, all under the age of 12, were pale, unnaturally rigid and polished, like expensive porcelain dolls. Their eyes, though closed, seemed to possess a chilling sentience, an eternal, silent judgment. They were placed to look like they were simply resting, perhaps waiting to be roused for a church service that would never come. Ezekiel, Thomas, Isaac, Samuel, Caleb, Daniel, and Ezra. 7 brothers, eternally enshrined in their father's terrible, possessive grief. Wyatt forced himself to move, his mind fighting the wave of nausea. This was the horror, not a ghost, but the tangible, preserved evidence of a psychological break, a refusal to accept loss. Jedediah hadn't lost his sons, he had simply made them permanent. He moved past the cabinets, the light of the lantern reflecting unnervingly in the glass. He noticed that the clothing on the oldest, Ezekiel, was beginning to fray, the preservation failing after almost 2 decades. Jedediah's maintenance was a constant, losing battle against time and nature. In the center of the room, lying haphazardly on a rough wooden bench, was the reason for the initial investigation. Silas Kemp. Silas wasn't dead, but he was unconscious, heavily bound by coarse rope. His head was bandaged, and he was covered by a stained canvas tarp. The room's cold and the chemical odors had slowed his metabolism, keeping him in a deep, unnatural slumber. Jedediah must have hit him when Silas stumbled upon the cellar, then kept him here, waiting for the right time to dispose of him. Wyatt's immediate task shifted. Rescue Silas and get out. As he reached for his knife to cut the ropes, a faint sound reached him from the cellar entrance. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate. Martha Larkins was descending. Wyatt extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging the chamber into absolute choking darkness. He drew his revolver, the cold steel a sudden, comfortless weight in his hand. He pressed his back against the rough wall near the bench, next to the sleeping peddler, waiting. Martha's steps were slow. He heard her set down a basket, the light clink of metal against metal. She had brought a lantern too, but its beam was weak, illuminating only the food stores in the outer room. "Ezra, my love," Martha whispered, her voice dry and brittle, yet laced with a horrific maternal tenderness. "Mother is here." She walked into the preservation chamber. Wyatt could now see her silhouette. A small, stooped woman dressed in a faded black dress, her hair pulled back tightly. She walked straight to the cabinet holding the youngest preserved boy, Ezra, and began to polish the glass with a piece of cloth. "Your father has gone to town to bring back the good oil," she mumbled, her words thick with devotion and insanity. "We must make sure you remain pristine. We cannot let the rot claim you, not like the others tried to claim you." Wyatt realized the depth of the shared delusion. Martha was not an accomplice under duress. She was the boy's keeper, maintaining the fragile illusion that her children were still present, still waiting. The opportunity for escape was closing. Wyatt knew he had only seconds. He had to decide: subdue Martha, or try to slip past her and carry the unconscious Silas up the steep stairs, risking noise and discovery. He chose the third, most dangerous option: distraction. He reached out and deliberately knocked over a small ceramic jar from the food shelves in the outer room. The resulting crash was loud and sharp, echoing through the silence. Martha froze. Her head snapped toward the noise, her frail body tensing. "Who is there?" she demanded, her voice suddenly sharp and fearful, the maternal tenderness gone, replaced by the protectiveness of a mother guarding a terrible, impossible secret. She began to back away from the cabinet, her eyes wide, moving toward the sound. This was Wyatt's chance. He moved quickly to Silas, swiftly cutting the ropes and slinging the peddler's limp body over his shoulder. The weight was crushing, the silence imperative. He began the agonizingly slow climb up the narrow, creaking cellar stairs, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The horror was now entirely physical, a race against Martha's certain return. Wyatt emerged from the cellar, struggling under the weight of Silas, the harsh sunlight a sudden, blinding contrast to the subterranean gloom. He managed to secure the hatch, dropping the wooden bar back into place, the loud thud feeling like a gunshot in the silent yard. Martha was still in the outer part of the cellar. He heard a muffled, frantic sound, a low, angry wail, followed by the clatter of her returning to the preservation chamber. She must have realized the noise was a distraction, or perhaps noticed the missing peddler. "Jedediah!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic and fury. "Jedediah! He is trying to take them!" Wyatt didn't wait. He moved toward the edge of the yard, dragging Silas toward the wooded trail. He had to get to his horse, which was tethered a quarter-mile away, beyond the immediate property line. As they reached the rusted iron gate, a new figure appeared in the doorway of the house. Elias. The young boy stood frozen, watching Wyatt haul the body of the peddler, his frail arms clutching a worn, faded blanket. Wyatt paused, his chest heaving, his mouth dry. He looked directly at Elias, making no move to pull his weapon. "Elias," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm leaving. Are you coming with me? You don't have to stay here." The boy didn't move. His gaze was not on Wyatt, but on the cellar hatch, a look of profound, entrenched fear and, most disturbingly, resignation. Elias was not just a victim. He was a silent participant in the horror, living under the shadow of his preserved brothers. His father's delusion had become his reality. From the window, Wyatt saw Martha, her face contorted, her hands pressed against the glass. She was screaming again, but the sound was muffled by the thick old wood. "Go, Sheriff, go!" Elias whispered, the words barely audible. "He will be back soon. Please leave me." Wyatt knew he couldn't force the boy. Not now. He needed to secure Silas and confirm the facts of the preservation before he could return with the full force of the law and attempt to extract Elias. The weight of the peddler was a physical anchor, forcing him to prioritize survival. He nodded, a gesture of grim promise, and began dragging Silas into the dense cover of the woods. The journey was agonizingly slow. The oppressive heat, the thick brush, and the dead weight of the unconscious man pushed Wyatt to his physical limits. Finally, they reached the clearing where his horse, Rebel, was tied. Wyatt hoisted Silas onto the saddle, securing him roughly. He mounted behind him, reversing their path, pushing Rebel hard down the trail. As they rode, Wyatt's mind began to organize the chaos. The 7 bodies, the truth of the 7 bodies, was the foundation of the crime. Jedediah hadn't just murdered. He had committed a sustained, meticulous act of desecration and control, enforced by Martha's silent complicity. But what had killed the boys? Natural causes, then preserved? Or had the preservation itself been the reason for their sickness? He reached the outskirts of Willow Creek and found Garth waiting near the creek, pacing nervously. "Sheriff, you found him." Garth rushed forward, helping Wyatt steady the unconscious Silas. "I found him, and I found the truth," Wyatt stated, the words clipped and flat. He was covered in sweat and grime, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Garth, Silas is alive, but he's been clubbed and drugged. We need to get him to Doc Hemlock. No questions to the doc, just tell him it was a hunting accident. We can't risk this getting out yet." He looked back at the woods, toward the hidden farm. "Jedediah Larkins is not just a hermit, Garth. He is a monster obsessed with keeping his children from leaving him. He preserved their bodies in his cellar. 7 of them." Garth stared, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the horror. "My God, Sheriff, and why?" "Denial, control, and a specific, terrible form of religious obsession, perhaps. We have the proof now. Silas is the witness, and the cellar holds the evidence. But Jedediah is on his way back from Harmony Crossing. He will know we were there." Wyatt took a moment to clean the dirt from his revolver, checking the loads. We have to move fast. Jedediah will return with fresh chemicals, see the disturbed cellar, and immediately realize the danger to his collection. He will either secure the cellar permanently or move to secure his only remaining son. The most immediate danger was to Elias. Jedediah's twisted grief was complete only when his sons were permanently present. If Elias tried to leave, Jedediah might see only one final terrible way to keep him. "Garth," Wyatt commanded, his tone shifting from investigative to tactical. "You are to take Silas and wait at the livery stable near the edge of town, out of sight. Keep your weapon ready. I am riding to Harmony Crossing. I need to intercept Jedediah Larkins before he makes it back to the farm and does something irreversible." The pursuit had begun. Wyatt knew Jedediah was driven by a madness that had been brewing for 20 years, a volatile mix of religious fervor and possessive love. Confronting him on the open road, away from the protected lair of the farm, was the only viable strategy to prevent the final, inevitable tragedy of the Larkins family. Wyatt pushed Rebel hard toward Harmony Crossing, the route Jedediah Larkins would take. The sun was at its zenith, the heat punishing, but the adrenaline from the cellar confrontation kept Wyatt focused. He needed an isolated spot, a place where he could confront Jedediah without witnesses, minimizing the danger to the town. He found it at Miller's Ridge, a narrow stretch of road that wound through a copse of old oak trees, far enough from any neighboring farms that sounds wouldn't carry. He dismounted, tied Rebel loosely to a low branch, and took cover behind a massive, moss-covered boulder. He checked his revolver once more, the polished wood of the grip feeling smooth and familiar. It was almost 2 hours later when he heard the approach, the steady, rhythmic trot of a heavy farm horse, the creak of an old wagon. Jedediah Larkins was returning. Wyatt peered over the boulder. Jedediah was alone, sitting ramrod straight on the wagon seat, his stern face shaded by a broad-brimmed hat. The back of the wagon was covered by a tarp, beneath which Wyatt knew lay the essential supplies: food, tools, and the gallons of preservation chemicals. As the wagon drew even with his position, Wyatt stood up, his revolver leveled, his voice clear and resonant in the oppressive quiet of the woods. "Hold it right there, Jedediah!" The wagon lurched to a halt. Jedediah did not immediately react. He simply turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes, usually cold, now containing a disturbing mixture of panic and murderous rage. "Sheriff Thorne," he rasped, his hand dropping slowly toward the shotgun resting against the seat. "I should have known you wouldn't leave well enough alone." "Don't touch the gun, Jedediah," Wyatt warned, stepping out into the open, positioning himself so the boulder was a clear barrier between them. "I was in your cellar today. I saw the boys. I saw Silas Kemp." The mention of the cellar and the preserved sons hit Jedediah like a physical blow. The control Wyatt had observed in the man shattered, his face twisted into a mask of frantic, insane desperation. "You had no right," Jedediah bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. "They are mine. They are home. They are safe from the fever and the rot and this wicked, wicked world. They are dead, Jedediah," Wyatt stated firmly, cutting through the delusion. "And you have kept them from their rest. You have desecrated them. Silas Kemp saw your obsession and you struck him down. He sought to steal them," Jedediah shouted, ignoring the reality of the situation. He grabbed the shotgun and swung it up, aiming it at Wyatt's chest. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He dropped low behind the boulder as the shotgun roared, the pellets tearing into the bark above his head, showering him with wood chips and dust. The sound of the blast was deafening, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid. Wyatt sighted his revolver from his crouched position. He was an expert shot, but he aimed not to kill, but to disable. He fired a single shot, aiming for the front wheel of the wagon. The bullet struck true. The wooden spoke splintered with a sharp crack, the wheel collapsing inward. The wagon tilted violently, throwing Jedediah off balance. The shotgun clattered harmlessly to the ground. Wyatt moved fast, vaulting over the boulder and rushing toward the dazed man. He kicked the shotgun out of reach and brought the barrel of his own revolver down hard on the side of Jedediah's head. Jedediah collapsed, a dead weight, his body hitting the dirt road with a dull thud. The fight was over almost before it began. Wyatt stood over him, breathing heavily, the smell of burnt powder and dust heavy in the air. He quickly bound Jedediah's hands and feet with the ropes he'd brought, securing the man to the wagon's remaining axle. He then began the grim work of searching the wagon. Beneath the tarp, beside sacks of flour and sugar, were 10 large, sealed glass bottles filled with the pale, yellowish, pungent fluid, the new batch of preservation chemicals, enough to keep the terrible work going for another year. Wyatt realized the depth of the planning, the sheer meticulous effort required to maintain the lie. Jedediah's madness was not a sudden burst of violence, but a sustained 20-year project of denial. He mounted Rebel and tied the reins of the disabled wagon to his saddle horn. He knew the journey back to Willow Creek would be long, and the sight of the town's most private citizen being brought in bound and defeated would cause an immediate sensation. But his mind was still on the farm. Martha was still there, and Elias. Jedediah's final, desperate, gasping words before passing out echoed in his mind. "You can't take them. She won't let you. She is protecting the last one. She is keeping him safe, too." Wyatt hadn't killed Jedediah, but he had removed the head of the operation. He had stopped the purchase of the chemicals, but the keeper was still in the house, alone with the preserved dead and the terrified living. The horror was not yet contained. Wyatt needed to get Jedediah into the makeshift town jail and immediately return to the farm, praying he hadn't given Martha too much time. The sight of Sheriff Thorne leading a damaged wagon with the bound Jedediah Larkins was the most sensational event Willow Creek had seen in decades. The news traveled like wildfire, but Wyatt clamped down on the specifics. He told the gathered townsfolk Jedediah was arrested for the assault and kidnapping of Silas Kemp, keeping the horrific details of the cellar a secret. He handed Jedediah over to the recovered, albeit bruised, Deputy Garth. "Keep him locked tight, Garth. Do not leave the cell and tell no one, what you saw in those papers or what I told you. This is about Elias now. He's still up there, alone with his mother." Wyatt rode back immediately, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the hills. He felt a desperate urgency now. With Jedediah gone, Martha's mental state would be unstable. She was the one who tended to the boys, the one who lived in the most intimate proximity to the delusion. Without her husband's control, her protectiveness might turn lethal. He approached the farm in the twilight. The house was a silhouette, darker and more silent than before. There was no smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows. The air itself felt cold. Wyatt dismounted and moved toward the back of the house. He found the cellar hatch exactly as he had left it, the wooden bar in place. The exterior of the house gave no sign of struggle, but the overall stillness was profoundly unsettling. He didn't knock. He drew his revolver and kicked the back door inward with a single sharp motion. The kitchen was clean, every plate stacked, every surface scrubbed. The smell of disinfectant and starch hung in the air, a testament to Martha's obsessive order, the kind of order that masked chaos. "Martha, Elias?" Wyatt called out, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. He moved through the house methodically. The ground floor was empty. He mounted the creaking stairs, the sound loud and abrasive. Upstairs, the house was partitioned into several small bedrooms. He checked the first, finding a plain room with a single bed and a small handmade cross on the wall, clearly Jedediah and Martha's. He opened the second door. It was a child's room. The room was meticulously clean but desolate. There were 7 tiny folded sets of children's clothes sitting on a wooden chest, but the focus of the room was the small, narrow bed. Elias was there. He was lying on his back, eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. His small hands were clutched tightly to his chest. Wyatt rushed to the bed. "Elias, are you hurt? Where is your mother?" Elias didn't respond to the words. He simply turned his head to face Wyatt, and the sheriff's heart plunged. The boy's pupils were wide and fixed. He was breathing shallowly, his skin cold and clammy. Wyatt felt the boy's wrist, a slow, thready pulse. Elias had been drugged, far more effectively than Silas Kemp had been. Mama said it was the only way. Elias managed to whisper, his voice slurred and weak. She said I had to be perfect, like them. Wyatt understood instantly. Martha, with Jedediah gone, had moved to complete the terrible cycle. She was preparing Elias for preservation. The drugs were likely a powerful sleeping draught meant to mimic the initial sickness that had allowed Jedediah to begin his macabre collection of the others. Where did she go, Elias? Where did she get the drug? The boy pointed a shaking finger toward a small, locked wooden box on the bedside table. Wyatt smashed the lock with the butt of his revolver. Inside was a vial of clear liquid, unlabeled, but smelling strongly of opium and a bitter chemical additive. Wyatt looked down at the boy, then at the empty room. Martha was not there. She had administered the drug and left. But where would she go? His eyes fell on the window. Outside, the gathering darkness obscured the farmyard. But through the panes, he saw a movement near the old ramshackle barn. A faint, flickering light. A fire. Wyatt gently placed Elias back down, pulling the blankets up. "Stay still, Elias. I'm coming back for you." He raced back downstairs. He burst out the back door and ran toward the flickering light. The air was now filled with the acrid smell of burning straw and wood. Martha was standing in the center of the barnyard, a lantern swinging loosely from her hand. Around her, stacked in a frantic, haphazard circle, were the Larkins' meager worldly possessions: furniture, clothing, photographs, and children's toys, the possessions of the 7 preserved sons, which Jedediah and Martha had kept for years. She had poured the remaining preservation chemicals from the abandoned wagon over the pile. The sickly sweet, pungent vapor mixed with the smoke. "They're going to steal them, Sheriff," Martha said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, flat and dead. "They want the boys to rot, but I won't let them. We must destroy all the traces of their existence first. They must be pure and alone." She dropped the lantern. The flames roared instantly, fueled by the highly flammable chemicals leaping 20 feet into the air. The barn was immediately engulfed, the fire reflecting crazily in Martha's vacant eyes. Wyatt realized her final desperate plan, an act of obliteration. She was burning the memories, the physical tokens of her sons' lives, to ensure that only the perfectly preserved bodies in the cellar remained, the true form of her children. He lunged for her, grabbing her arm. "Martha, stop this. Elias is still in the house. He's sick. We have to help him." Martha did not resist. She turned to him, her face completely empty of sanity, a terrifying mask of quiet, final defeat. "Elias is safe now, Sheriff. He will join his brothers. Perfectly still, perfectly home." He looked back at the house. The fire from the barn was dangerously close, threatening to spread. Wyatt's dilemma was brutal. Martha was clearly insane and dangerous, but Elias was dying inside the house. He needed to secure Martha and save the boy. He dragged Martha away from the burning barn toward the well. He tied her hands roughly with a piece of heavy rope he pulled from a hanging horse bridle, securing her to the solid stone wall of the well house. He looked once more at the raging inferno, then raced back to the house. The smoke was beginning to drift towards the main structure. He had precious little time to save Elias before the fire claimed the last Larkins son in the cruelest of ironies. Wyatt burst back into the bedroom, the air now thick with the smell of smoke carried on the evening breeze. Elias lay exactly as he had left him, his breathing even more shallow. Wyatt knew he couldn't wait for a doctor. He had to get the boy out of the toxic environment and try to clear the poison from his system. He gently lifted Elias, wrapping him securely in the heavy woolen blanket from the bed. The boy was frail and light, a ghostly weight in his arms. As he descended the stairs carrying Elias, he saw a final, desperate act of Martha's insanity. In the living room, she had taken the only remaining family portrait, a large framed photograph of the 7 preserved boys and Elias, and smashed it, scattering the glass fragments across the floor. She had defaced the image of the preserved boys, but left the picture of Elias untouched, marked only by the shattered glass. Wyatt stepped carefully over the debris and made it out the front door, away from the encroaching smoke and the roaring flames of the barn. He carried Elias to his horse, Rebel, and carefully secured the boy to the saddle in front of him, keeping his body pressed against his own for warmth and support. He glanced back at the scene. Martha, tied and silent by the well house, her face illuminated by the inferno she had created. The barn, now a towering beacon of destruction, and the house, still standing, holding the macabre secret in its cellar. The 7 silent brothers, preserved by a father's delusion and watched over by a mother's final desperate act of loyalty to that delusion. "Hold on, Elias," Wyatt whispered, mounting Rebel. "We're going home." The ride back was slow and agonizingly deliberate. Wyatt monitored Elias's breathing, praying the boy's young constitution could fight the powerful sedative. He bypassed Willow Creek, riding directly to Doc Hemlock's remote cabin outside of town. He still needed to keep the full horror a secret, if only until he could secure the necessary state intervention. Doc Hemlock was a gruff but competent man. He took one look at Elias's condition, his pupils pinned and his pulse faint, and instantly knew it was an overdose. Wyatt explained the situation vaguely. A terrible sickness at the isolated farm. The doctor didn't press for details, immediately setting to work, administering an antitoxin and stimulating the boy's system. While the doc worked, Wyatt rode back into town. He found Garth waiting at the livery stable, Silas still resting, weak but awake. Wyatt sent Garth back up to the Larkins farm with 2 volunteers and strict instructions: secure Martha and wait for him to arrive. He also dispatched a separate rider with a sealed letter to the county judge, detailing the cellar and the need for a full state-sanctioned investigation and retrieval order. Wyatt then walked to the jailhouse where Jedediah was held. The man was awake now, his head bandaged, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying clarity. "You can't save him, Sheriff." Jedediah spat through the bars, his voice hoarse. "He belongs with his brothers, forever." "Elias is alive, Jedediah," Wyatt stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "And your wife is in custody. Your work is over, the cellar is secured, and the 7 boys will finally be given a proper burial." Jedediah began to laugh, a dry, rasping sound that turned quickly into a choked, terrifying sob. "No, you don't understand. They weren't meant to die. The fever was a lie. I only wanted them to be still, to be safe. I killed them. I was the one who gave them the sleeping draught, then the chemicals. I couldn't bear to see them run away or grow old or leave me. They are perfection now." The chilling confession confirmed Wyatt's worst fears. It wasn't just macabre preservation, it was premeditated filicide, driven by an obsessive pathological need for control. The fever was the carefully planned, systematic murder of his sons, one by one, over 7 years, an act enabled by his isolation and a complicit wife who tended the preserved results. Wyatt felt a profound weariness. The horror was not supernatural. It was the darkest, most terrifying capacity of human psychology. He left Jedediah to his grief and madness and walked out into the cool night air. The case was solved. Silas was alive. The killer was captured, and the secret was exposed. But Elias was still fighting for his life, the last victim of his father's insane love. Wyatt rode back to Doc Hemlock's cabin, knowing the investigation was far from over. The physical evidence had to be secured, and Elias had to survive to tell his tale. The terrifying truth is out, but the final fate of Elias is still uncertain. Don't miss the conclusion. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us uncover more terrifying, real-life mysteries. The night passed slowly in Doc Hemlock's small cabin. Wyatt sat by the fireplace, cleaning the grime of the farm from his uniform, watching the doc work over Elias. By dawn, the color had returned faintly to the boy's cheeks, and his breathing was stronger. Elias would live. Doc Hemlock, a man used to the quiet tragedies of rural life, looked at Wyatt, his face grim. "He'll be weak for weeks, Sheriff. That was a strong dose of opium mixed with something I don't care to name. But he's out of danger." Wyatt nodded, a flicker of relief easing the tension in his shoulders. "Thank you, Doc. You saved him." With Elias stable, Wyatt's focus shifted back to the farm. He rode back to Willow Creek, where the judge's official order was waiting. The whole town was buzzing, the true details of the cellar slowly beginning to leak out despite Garth's efforts. The news was met with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and profound shame for having ignored the dark corner in their community for so long. He gathered a small, tight group: the judge, a state marshal who had ridden in overnight, and a wagon with embalmers and undertakers from the city, men prepared for a grim task. They rode up to the Larkins farm under a gray, overcast sky. The barn was a smoking ruin, a black scar on the landscape. Martha had been secured by Garth, sitting motionless inside the now empty, dust-covered living room of the house, her eyes fixed on the blank space where the family portrait had once hung. She offered no resistance, seeming detached from reality, completely lost in her delusion. The state marshal placed Martha under formal arrest, and she was escorted away, heading for the state asylum, a fate Wyatt believed was kinder than any jail. Wyatt led the solemn procession down into the cellar. The moment the embalmers saw the 7 preserved bodies, they recoiled. They were professionals, accustomed to death, but not to this sustained, meticulous, and utterly deranged act of preservation. The judge himself stood silent, the warrant shaking slightly in his hand. "My God, Thorne," he finally whispered. This defies all reason." "It defies all humanity, Your Honor," Wyatt replied, his voice flat. "But it is real. The Larkins never lost their sons to a fever. They kept them." The official work began. The embalmers, using specialized crates, slowly and respectfully removed the 7 bodies from the glass cabinets. The work was delicate, the preserved state of the boys unsettlingly fragile. Each name, Ezekiel, Thomas, Isaac, Samuel, Caleb, Daniel, Ezra, was read aloud before the boy was placed into his final resting crate. As the bodies were lifted out, Wyatt noticed a discrepancy. The cabinets were custom-built, each compartment perfectly sized for the boy it held. However, the 7th cabinet, the one that had held Ezra, the boy Martha had been tending to, had a false back. Wyatt signaled to the marshal. They carefully pried the backboard loose. Behind it, concealed in the damp earthen cavity, was a leather-bound, tightly sealed journal. It was Jedediah's ledger. Wyatt opened it. The pages were filled with Jedediah's precise, looping script. It was not a confession, but a horrifyingly meticulous record of his project. The ledger detailed the dates of each son's death and the exact quantities of the chemicals used for their preservation. But the entries were not just scientific. They were religious. Jedediah described the preservation process as sanctification, the act of making his children perpetually clean and pure by saving them from the corruption of the world and the inevitability of change. The final pages, written just days before Silas Kemp arrived, provided the key to the entire mystery. Jedediah had begun to despair about Elias. Elias was fragile, weak, but growing older. He was starting to question his silent mother and his stern father. Jedediah wrote, "Elias is becoming too willful. The rot of the outside world is already taking hold. He must be made perfect soon. He is the last." The motive for Silas Kemp's attack was also made clear. Silas had asked Martha about the strange metallic smell in the kitchen and mentioned he had supplies that might neutralize the odor. Jedediah had overheard this conversation. Silas didn't see the bodies. He simply noticed the smell. Jedediah realized the peddler was a threat to the entire secret, a man who might tell the local sheriff about the strange chemical smell at the Larkins farm. The attack on Silas was a preemptive strike to silence a perceived threat to the stability of his home. The ledger was the final piece of the puzzle. a documented, rational record of a completely irrational crime. Wyatt closed the journal. He had the confession, the bodies, the motive, and the witness, Silas, now ready to testify. The cycle of terror that had haunted the Larkins homestead was broken. The 7 silent boys were finally free, and the last of the sons was safe. Wyatt stepped out of the cellar, handing the ledger to the judge. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the smoke from the ruined barn. The darkness had been exposed, and the truth, for all its horror, had been brought to light. The news of the Larkins cellar sent seismic shock waves through Willow Creek and across the state of Missouri. The details, the 7 preserved bodies, the systematic murders, the psychological breakdown of the parents, became a dark legend overnight. The horror was rooted not in the fantastical, but in the disturbing depths of human obsession and control. Wyatt Thorne, the sheriff who had dared to look closer, became a reluctant hero. He spent the next week managing the aftermath. The trial of Jedediah Larkins was swift and brutal. The evidence, the bodies, the chemical supplies, the peddler Silas Kemp's testimony, and most damningly, the meticulous preservation ledger, was incontrovertible. Jedediah's defense, based on religious delusion and insanity, was accepted only as context for his premeditated actions. He was found guilty of 7 counts of murder and the attempted murder of Silas Kemp. Jedediah was sentenced to death. On the gallows, his final words were not of remorse, but of his perverse, unwavering commitment to his delusion. "They are perfect now," he muttered to the crowd, his eyes searching the sky. "I kept them safe. They are home." Martha Larkins was ruled unfit to stand trial. She was committed to the state lunatic asylum. She never spoke another coherent word, dedicating her days to tending to an imaginary row of small glass-fronted cabinets. The keeper was now herself a captive of her own mind. The 7 sons were given a proper, respectful burial in the Willow Creek Cemetery. The entire town attended, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a profound, collective sense of grief and remorse for their past indifference. It was a funeral for children lost not to nature, but to the madness that lurked right next door. Silas Kemp was paid a generous state settlement, and after recovering, quietly left Willow Creek, promising never to return. He carried the scars of his encounter, a quiet man who knew the worst secret of the Ozark foothills. Elias Larkins was the last casualty and the last hope. After his recovery, he was placed in the care of a distant, reputable family in St. Louis. Wyatt visited him before he left, bringing him a small carved wooden horse, a gesture of normalcy. Elias was a hollow child, his spirit bruised by years of silence and the shadow of the 7 preserved brothers. He never spoke of his parents or the cellar, but as he looked at Wyatt, the former sheriff saw a flicker of relief, a fragile hope for a future free from the toxic environment of perfection. "Thank you, Sheriff," Elias whispered, clutching the toy. "They won't be able to find me now." "No, son," Wyatt promised. "They won't." Wyatt knew that Elias's journey was far from over. The psychological trauma of growing up in that house, under the silent gaze of his dead brothers, would define his life. But he was free, and that was the victory. As the dust of the investigation settled, Wyatt Thorne's own past caught up with him. The intensity of the Larkins case, the constant exposure to extreme human suffering, reawakened the unresolved traumas from his Pinkerton days. He had found justice, but not peace. He returned to his small, quiet office. The town was safe, but Wyatt himself felt irrevocably damaged. He looked at the tarnished silver locket he always carried, the reminder of his own personal losses that had driven him to seek a quiet post. He realized quiet was an illusion. The capacity for darkness was everywhere. He knew he couldn't stay in Willow Creek. He had exposed the town's darkest secret, and in doing so had exposed his own deepest vulnerability. He penned his resignation to the judge. He planned to leave, not to run from the law, but to run from the silence that now felt worse than any noise. The horror had been solved, but the man who solved it was now adrift. He finished his letter, blew out the lamp, and stepped out into the night, leaving the badge on the desk. The town was finally quiet, but the silence now carried the chilling echo of 7 preserved lives and the unsettling final words of a madman. 2 months after the execution of Jedediah Larkins, Sheriff Wyatt Thorne's successor, a younger, more energetic man from the city, took the post in Willow Creek. Life was slowly returning to a cautious, watchful normalcy. The townsfolk still spoke of the Macabre Cellar, but the focus was now on the future, and on the new, meticulously maintained plots in the cemetery. Wyatt, now simply a solitary traveler, found himself in a small, isolated cabin high in the mountains of Colorado. He had sought the absolute silence of the wilderness, hoping to purge the images of the cellar and the chilling finality of Jedediah's control. He spent his days reading and writing, documenting the Larkins case in a separate, sealed journal. He needed to understand the mechanics of the horror, not just the emotion of it. The Larkins case was a chilling lesson that the most profound forms of terror are rooted in the human fear of loss and the pathological attempt to defy natural order. One afternoon, a delivery man, having tracked him through a series of general store addresses, arrived with a final sealed package from Willow Creek. It was the personal effects from the Larkins farm, released by the state after the final legal proceedings. Inside the package, Wyatt found only 2 items. 1. A faded, handwritten note from Martha Larkins, found tucked into her dress pocket before she was committed. It was written on the night she drugged Elias. It read, "The fever is a blessing, Elias. It makes you ready to be loved forever. You will be still. You will be mine." It was the final, twisted proof of her willing complicity. 2. A small, polished wooden carving, a miniature, perfectly formed coffin. It was the toy Wyatt had first stumbled upon on the cellar floor. But this time, it was not alone. Inside the tiny, hinged lid, nestled on a small piece of velvet, was a single, long, silvery strand of Elias's hair. Wyatt's blood ran cold. He recognized the meticulousness. Jedediah and Martha had not only preserved the bodies of their sons, but they had also created miniature ceremonial reminders, tributes to their final perfect state. The coffin was not just a toy, it was a preparation. But there was a final horrifying realization in the discovery. The hair, the tiny final token, was a signal. Before being taken into custody, before being committed, Martha had gone back into the house and had taken a piece of Elias to add to her collection. It was a final, chilling act of control, a psychological tether that she, in her insanity, believed still kept her last boy tied to the farm. Wyatt sat alone in the quiet cabin, the tiny, polished coffin heavy in his palm. The physical horror was gone, the killers incarcerated, the bodies buried, but the echo of control lingered. He packed the wooden coffin and the note into his own personal ledger. He knew the threat was not physical, it was psychological. Jedediah and Martha Larkins had destroyed their family not with ghosts or magic, but with silence, isolation, and a possessive love warped by madness. Wyatt realized he could never outrun the darkness. The only way to win was to expose it. He would use his experience, his detailed knowledge of the Larkins case, and the lessons of his past to continue his journey, not as a sheriff seeking peace, but as a man seeking truth. He would hunt the real monsters, the human ones. He closed his journal, the case finally, truly closed. He had stared into the macabre cellar and had seen the worst of humanity, and he had survived. But the chilling truth remained. The most dangerous secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight, preserved by the chilling, twisted love of a family determined to keep their children home forever.